Hello, good morning and welcome to today's Movers and Shakers virtual event. My name is Natasha Salter and I'm Managing Director of Movers and Shakers, and I hope you're having a really good start to your week. So I know most people on today's event know all about Movers and Shakers. This year marks our 27th year of bringing together and connecting the leaders, the influencers and the decision makers across the UK property industries, linking the private and public sector, obviously to do business, to win work, to do deals, but also to collaborate, to share and to engage in dialogue and meaningful output. So really excited to be finishing this year, looking forward to a new year next year where we'll have a mix of in-person and of course still virtual events. But today's virtual event is looking at the outputs of COP-26. So today's topic is post COP-26. What are the implications and what are the challenges for the UK property industry? We've got a great panel today and we welcome Guy Granger, who is the Global Head of Sustainability Services and ESG at JLL, Alex Note, who is the Placemaking and Investment Director at PFP Capital, and Rob Lane, Chief Property Officer for Clarion Housing Group, and our guest chair, good friend, Susan Freeman, partner, of course, of Mishcon Dwyer. Welcome to all of our panel. Now, today's session will be an hour long. It's a panel session and Susan will chair and ask questions, but don't forget there's always an opportunity for our audience to engage and to ask questions. So please go onto the question tab, think of something that you'd like to ask one or all of the panel and let us know, because we do want to get everybody involved. And this is all about, as we say, collaboration, forming opinion together and for purposeful outputs. So do get involved. And the topic today is a very important one. So we're looking at what came out of COP26 and bearing in mind that about 38% of the global carbon emission comes from the real estate industry, and the industry consumes about 40% of the world's energy. UK real estate has significant responsibility and obviously will have significant impact on reaching net zero by 2050. So this is a really important conversation. And obviously there were successes that came out of COP, and there were, some people would say, some failures and things that were missing. So it's really important to take a look at that. And to look particularly this morning, I think, at housing, because obviously there is a real issue in terms of housing numbers in the UK. So how does this work with retrofit? The financial cost we know is really high. How are we going to balance that cost with actually going net zero carbon? We've also got Guy obviously on the panel today, so we'll be looking at commercial real estate as well and the consequences, and looking at technologies, their availability, the skill sets, and looking at how we involve the community, which is always really, really important in this. So I'm going to hand over to Susan and to her panel. And as I said, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. Please do so, or put your comments in the chat. And we'll come together at the end of the event. So do enjoy today, do ask questions, and don't forget to network with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And as Lee says, it's just a few weeks since we hosted COP26 in Glasgow. And so a very important time to reflect and look at what's been achieved and what's the reality for the UK real estate sector. We're going to have to deliver carbon reduction on a huge scale. It's going to be needed both for commercial and residential property, as Lee mentioned. So we have a terrific panel this morning, and we're going to drill down into some of the practicalities and the reality of what needs to happen. And as Lee mentioned, we'd like you to ask questions. Please put them into the chat function, and we will get to as many of the questions as we can. So let's start off by looking at the outcomes of COP26. And I'd be interested to know what each of the panelists think of the Glasgow Climate Pact. What are the biggest achievements and what's actually missing? So, Guy, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Well, just at a very high level, I think that we had to be realistic about what COP26 could achieve in the first place, in the knowledge that some of the bigger nations weren't going to be able to commit to what some of the public wanted them to commit to, particularly around coal. However, looking at it at a high level, we bridged the gap quite significantly. If all the targets are met, actually, we're going into COP, the planet was heating up terribly fast, and coming out of COP, the targets that have been set mean that we could limit that heating up to sort of roughly 1.8 degrees, which was a lot more significant. The announcements about deforestation and methane were massive. The announcements on finance were massive, right? So there was serious structural change. The fact of the matter is, none of it's going to happen unless those targets are put into action. And I think we'll look back on COP26 as the moment in time when it left no hiding place for businesses or governments. Because let me just remind people that in 12 months' time, every government, every city, every state has to go back with a revised target because the targets are not ambitious enough. In 2 years' time, there will be a global stock take where every government is going to be measured on how they're doing against their targets, right? In the next 2 years, people are going to get found out if they're not doing things, and that applies for business as well. So I think for the real estate sector, setting targets is not good enough. You've got to show the action that you're doing. So in 12 months' time, can you turn around and say, this is what I've done? Not this is the target I've set, this is what I've done. And it includes investing into technology and innovation, and other industries were way, way more on the front foot around technology and innovation. So I think a lot of learnings, a lot of takeaways, but it's all about action now.
Okay, thank you, Guy. And we'll be coming back to discuss how we're actually going to show action, and also to talk about technology and how that can help. So Alex, coming to you, any reflections, I mean, particularly on what's missing?
Well, I think the point is that there's always inherently a time lag in the development of like actual meaningful policy and action beyond these kind of grand statements. And as Guy said, the targets are one thing, the doing is another. So, you know, that for the institutional investment market, where I spend my time as fund manager, we are now looking at the impact of TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This is mandatory reporting around essentially tying climate risks to financial risk. This came out of Paris 2015. So it's been like, you know, there's a 6-year time lag there really before that becomes something that materially bites in the investment market. And that is, frankly, what is driving an awful lot of the institutional investors. This mandatory reporting that is dripping down, you know, for us it's through the FCA, but there are all sorts of, there's all sorts of regimes at European level, at UK level, at other. So it, again, not perfect, but those are the things that are starting to drive real public disclosure on reporting, is driving a lot of different institutional investment decisions. So I think recognizing there is a time lag and that actually 5 to 6 years is pretty good going for a global policy to kind of come together, but it's not quick enough because we're already so far behind. I think I was pleased to see that real estate had more of a presence at COP. I think very frequently in the past, it's been sort of oil and gas and transport and the more kind of visible areas. But I think to Lee's point at the beginning, we're starting to be aware now of this 38% of global emissions in real estate. We've bobbed around that 40% mark for years. The bit that frustrates me is that 22% of the kind of energy use and 11% of the emissions are from residential. And everyone has sort of left that as the elephant in the room because it's far too complicated and granular. It's much easier to focus on nice, tidy, homogenous offices, shopping centres, the things that are very kind of easy to build, you know, I say easy with, you know, assuming the finances are sorted, but the granularity, the complex of kind of tenant and landlord relationship within residential, the different types of tenure, the very, very technical complexities that technologies that are great in Scotland don't work in Devon, and, you know, the kind of things, it's so nuanced. And that is what the kind of the fiddly unpicking that's got to be done. So having spent 18 months with the BPF, we've had an ESG and residential working group trying to look at all the different benchmarks and certifications that apply to residential property. And hardly any of them are developed specifically for resi. Almost all of them come out of the commercial sector. So it's great that commercial, and there is so much going on, and that is certainly further ahead. But I think my frustration is that having got real estate at the table, is we're still painting these very broad brushstrokes. So as soon as you talk about housing, you know, well, there's a gazillion typologies within housing, and, you know, let alone tenancy types and ownership types. And frankly, in terms of innovation and adoption, the big landlords and their customers are sort of tired of being used as guinea pigs for tech. where they kind of go, we need to run a pilot scheme. So can we come and talk to you, large RP with a nice stable portfolio? And this week we want to do, you know, radiant heat platforms. This week we want to do something in on your roof. And actually we need to get much better at sharing that innovation and that R&D, and I think at a national scale, rather than expecting individual organisations to just pick up that gap. So my frustration out of COP was that I think there was an opportunity for government to kind of support, or industry to coalesce around the R&D innovation gap we all know is there, but to say, let's not each do our own little thing, let's share and collaborate and actually do something at scale nationally that could then tackle the complexities of our stock.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. And we will come back to the R&D and tech and drill down a little bit about, you know, into housing and, as you say, the elephant in the room. So Rob, what are your thoughts?
So a little bit similar to Alex in the fact that I think COP26, you know, didn't really translate fantastically well to the person on the street. I think you know, the talk of, you know, global targets, you know, whether it's carbon zero by 2050, 2060, 2070, or lots of talk around coal, but actually how did that translate to what we need to do, you know, in our own homes every day in order to contribute to this? And I think there was a big opportunity missed with such a, you know, a global event happening in the UK to really translate down to the person on the street in terms of what we need to do differently and the steps that we need to take. And it sort of strikes straight to the same argument that Alex is making, which is this is all really quite complicated, and somehow we need to find some clarity, some translation in order to simplify this for people so that we can make some steps.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So Guy, I mean, I know that you were in Glasgow at COP26, and it was, you know, it was great that real estate was there, and you know, there were obviously other people there representing the sector. But do you think it's important that the UK real estate sector takes the lead on net zero, and what's the benefit of doing that? Or because the alternative seems to be waiting for the government to regulate.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to see that in one place there was a lot of business there was a lot of government and a lot of climate activists. When you add them all up, actually there's hundreds of thousands of people in Glasgow. The rest of Glasgow sort of left, and it was just populated by these people. And the way that those three sets of stakeholders interact is very different. I agree with Rob. I mean, the public's view is we're just not going quick enough. And also, what does it mean to me? You know, how can I make a difference? Honestly, I think the excuses are running out for business. I mean, yes, government does need to create some clarity around policy so that business can make well-informed decisions for the medium term. But let's be realistic here. Every government is just thinking about the next 3 to 5 years, right? Because every government has to get re-elected. That's the same all over the world. You know, we think we've got problems here in the UK. I mean, there's the same problems in the US. In France, we've got Macron just going up for an election. That's life, folks. That's what a democracy is about. So we can't expect too much from government. I mean, I think the latest heating and buildings policies are just so way short of the mark. It's unbelievable. So the interesting thing about the UK government is that the policies aren't really as effective as the rhetoric in terms of the language. But again, you know, are you surprised? This is what we're living with this government. So Mark Carney summed it up, I think, best when he was talking to the banking market specifically, but I think it applies to business, is the money's there. All right, businesses are well capitalized, low debt. We've got really low interest rate environment. You know, governments haven't got the money. The businesses have got the money. So I think that it requires leadership. Of course, business models are being impacted by this because we worked on a purely financial model before. It was income being capitalized. That was it. There was no E or S even put into the equation. And when it is now, if you actually put carbon pricing into all of the investment decisions, then it would look very different. But that's kind of what we've got to do. There was a lot of discussion around carbon pricing from government and from businesses. And I would say to most property investors or developers out there, the big businesses are putting carbon costs into their business models now. Behind the scenes, the carbon pricing is going in. So if you're not doing it, then the regulation that's coming down the track will get a lot more difficult for you. So that's definitely something to think about.
So, is it just the bigger companies that are doing that, or is it sort of filtering down?
Well, I mean, not all companies are public about this. So, I'm finding out the big investment managers are definitely starting to do it, no doubt, because they're obviously trying to work out what's the true underlying value of our assets once you take into account the transition of these assets to net zero carbon. Now, I'd be really interested on the residential side, but yeah, the house builders are starting to sign up to targets quicker than they ever have done before, and they've been sort of laggers in the past. I'm not talking about social house builders, but the usual house builders, the usual names, and we've got to get different ways of working into those practices as well. But I agree with what Alex and Rob said. To put it in perspective, there's 28 million houses or dwellings that need to be repurposed. There's 2 million commercial buildings that need to be repurposed. That kind of shows you the scale of the challenge.
That certainly puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Alex, you have your hand up.
Yeah, well, I think it is just that. So that I think the key word that comes out of this is transition. So again, in the TCFD regulation, it distinguishes between physical risk and transition risk. And one of the things that, with our industry, we build these very illiquid assets. Once they're built, you can retrofit them to a point, but there's a kind of limit to what you can change without demolishing and starting again. And we're learning, the risk of embodied carbon and that kind of thing. So making kind of targets in place, but actually the lack of clarity, particularly in policy, is around how we move through this transition period of what we have now to making it better. And that's particularly when you're lumbered with what are imperfect measures. So, we all know that energy performance certificates are not really a particularly useful measure of how energy efficient or how sustainable a property is, but they are the largest data set the government has. So they're what we're trying to use, and that's the baseline. But that in itself leads to sort of slightly skewed sort of assessments and measures. And this moving target of whether, we need to be getting everything to EPC C, B or A and by when, before you factor in how you do that in a housing market where there is no spare capacity. So if you can't retrofit on site, where do you put people while you're retrofitting a property? Now, there's all these, the nuances of the doing are really difficult. So I think even if you can assume the buy-in by leaders and by organisations to, yes, we have to do this, which certainly even 18 months ago was not there at all. I think, and Guy alluded to this, but there has been a massive shift in boardrooms from, it's discretionary, it's still a nice to do, but we don't to actually know this is a fundamental, we must do this. And the longer we wait, the harder it gets. I think the real risk there is that we have these creations of targets or policy statements which are sensible, but because they don't have enough detail about how you bridge that transition period, they create other problems. So the two quick examples, one is that the abolition of gas boilers announced as part of the Heat and Building Strategy at COP by 2035. Very sensible. We would love to be able to get rid of that. And if we could find, assume the funding and find the technical skills to refit that in all of our new builds, we would. But in the current market, 80% of our customers in Scotland would be pushed immediately into fuel poverty if we transition them all away from gas now. So we need to figure out a better way of making that work, not just so we can tick the net zero box, but so that we can ensure that our customers are looked after in a way that is sustainable. And so I think the risk of everything focusing on carbon, as important as that is, means that we lose the S and the G that we've done so much to surface in the past few years, to remember that we are about looking after kind of wider place and wider community. And the second is that, yes, government have this horrible kind of cycle of being focused around elections above all else, but there is this tendency to put things into the statute that become obsolete very quickly. And nowhere is that more obvious than when we're talking around tech and innovation and tools that we need to use. So things like combined heat and power, which is essentially burning stuff, but 10 years ago was seen as a really good sustainable solution. is less popular now. District heat networks, again, local authorities that have spent a lot of public money, been really encouraged to do so, to say this is a sustainable solution for you, are now struggling because investors are saying, well, that's not net zero, so we don't want to use it. And so you've got this sort of inherent kind of clash, because that was a well-intentioned technological solution that has already become slightly outdated, had a lot of public money, is now being tried to be implemented through the planning process as a requirement, but isn't really future-proofed at all. And those are the complexities I think we as an industry have got to work more with the public sector on.
It is challenging, isn't it? Because with the rate of change at the moment, I mean, obsolescence is all built into the planning system, because by the time you've got your planning and actually built, things have moved on. So Rob, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just wanted to come in on the back of that conversation, really. So, in terms of this whole move, in terms of whether business should lead and drive it forward, I think one of the challenges again comes back to the value that is placed upon net zero carbon solutions. So, house builders and the private sector will build what they can sell. And actually, if the person on the street isn't educated about the value of net zero carbon, they won't place any value on that when they're buying, and therefore costing that in is just sort of diminishing your margins in that sort of side. So what you need to do is actually have some legislation, and we're trying to do this obviously with the Future Home Standard that comes in and changes the way homes are built in the country, but also people on the street need to value this in the long run, in terms of when they're making a choice between houses. You know, are they going to buy the house which is net zero carbon ready, or the house that isn't? And that the one that's net zero carbon ready should be a more valuable house, and at the moment it isn't. So that's something that we need to think about. But in terms of us and the sector, where, I mean, Clarion are in a position with our land-led schemes now that, you know, we're already trying to take a lead on this, and all the new land-led schemes we build for next year will all be net zero carbon ready schemes. So we're costing that into our numbers already, and how we're moving forward. But the bigger challenge is not our new homes. In fact, that's a fairly short-term thing to solve. You know, we should hopefully get there in the next 3, 4, 5 years. The challenge is actually the 125,000 existing homes that Clarion has, and how we move those across and make those zero carbon ready. And there's a variety of different solutions and a variety of different complexities in that side to resolve. So what we again need there is really a view and a translation of what net zero carbon ready means for an existing home in the UK. And that is coming back to Alex's point. It has to be the balance between the technology and the things you put into the house and the cost of that, versus the running cost of that home when you switch over from a gas boiler to another form of heating, and the cost of that, because gas is a lot cheaper than electricity to run in a home. And that's the fundamental problem we have here, which is, you know, you've got the energy that you are sort of pumping into your house to heat it. It's how much of it leads through the walls and the ceiling. And that's the bit we've kind of got to resolve across the country, is what is that standard we're kind of aiming at? What is that level of energy efficiency we need to get to, so that when we switch over the supply, we don't cost ourselves a lot of money in doing that? And how do we get to? So it's complicated, because every house is going to be different, but we do need to get to a bit of clarity. And we need, not just in terms of EPCC or EPCB or EPCA, it's actually in terms of what do I need to do to my house? You know, what is it I need to do in terms of insulation, in terms of solar panels, whatever it might be? What is the changes that I need to make to my house, so that I can make this change? And when I switch over from a boiler to an air source heat pump or something else, I can be confident that is, you know, net zero carbon ready, and that is going to work and not cost me a fortune in terms of running my home. Yeah.
And also, who's going to pay for that? Because if you've got your average house owner who hasn't, you know, is happy with their gas boiler, or is happy with the way their house functions, they're then told that they've got to spend quite a lot of money in trying to make it to reduce carbon. It's, you know, it's going to cost a lot of money. And would we say at the moment that there's a a disparity between sort of residential housing market and commercial, because largely in the commercial world, people now have cottoned on to the fact that this is important and that carbon reduction is important. So if they're taking a lease of offices, it's something that actually is going to be, that they'll be looking at. I mean, Guy, what do you see? Have we convinced the commercial world that this actually is very urgent and needs to be dealt with? And does that mean that in the residential world, people will be waking up to this pretty soon?
Well, let's break down the commercial world. I think offices, you're right, Susan, and quite frankly, there's no excuse for offices. Offices are the most simple thing to get this right in, and even repurposing offices there should be a clear pathway. You just have to start from the right base and then work through it. And tenants value net zero carbon buildings in the office world, and capital investors value them. So I think offices is a no-brainer, and if offices don't get done, then quite frankly, the investment community need to just look in the mirror, because it's quite a simple use to get right. I think that retail's in a very different place. I think it's in a similar place to housing. What Rob said, I don't think retailers put any additional value on a net zero carbon building, and it's got very, very high energy intensity right now. I'm talking about shopping centres, really. So big challenge about transitioning those. But I would still say that that's possible. It's all about underlying value. I think the challenge with housing, and it's way, way greater, is that there's going to be a great divide between those who can afford and those who can't afford. And that's already bad enough, and this is going to make it worse. And quite frankly, we are looking for the government to take action here. But let's look around the world. Which governments actually have? Let's take a real pill here. The only governments that have tend to be the wealthy ones. The Nordics, we've seen some good examples. They tend to heavily subsidize sectors that need to go through this transition, so that actually the people who can't afford it are paid to do it. And that's the only way to do it. And what I'm worried about is that we're sitting here in 10 years' time still complaining that the government hasn't set anything. Let's, as business leaders, make the assumption the government isn't going to come to our rescue. So how are we going to do this? And even if the customers don't value it, is it building resilience into your business model to do it anyway, even if your margins are slightly diluted? That's the question I'm asking a lot of clients at the moment. And I think it's one that we have to answer as business leaders.
Thank you, Guy. Alex?
So I think let's take your point back, the ownership market. And Rob's point was exactly right, that there's not really been the kind of so what, why should I bother? So even those people who are personally interested or invested, who, go and research an air source heat pump, see if it's appropriate for their property and pay to fit it, will say, I'm not going to get the payback immediately. But those will tend to be the very minority, almost evangelical about we need to do something. But the green mortgage market, in terms of the volume of products that are out there, it's something like 0.04%, and the savings are pathetic. I mean, they are so notional. So until the mortgage market decides to make a meaningful impact in the way that green leases started in Australia in the commercial market as nice wrappers that then became slightly more punchy in terms of water use and energy use, and now they've become more standardized in commercial office across Europe and the US. I think when we start to see mortgage providers who actually make a green mortgage mean something more than just the branding and the tick in the box, so you can say you have one, I think that will maybe shift homeowner behavior. And that might be something about tying it in with your utilities or whatever, if we had more integrated infrastructure. I think the irony is that in the institutional rental market, because the volume of money that is backing significant part of the new build there is either caught by this legislation or just innately focused on ESG factors anyway, actually everything new that's being built for rent is pretty bloody good, actually, because it is being held to these standards already. But we know we can do it new. I think it's coming back to where we started, that the retrofit challenge is so huge, and because property is so granular, So now I can walk around with an EPC surveyor, a new scheme, and he will give 2 identical properties, similarly oriented, one a B and one an A, for reasons that we can't quite fathom until we kind of go and unpick it. So if you extrapolate that to existing stock being occupied very differently, it's just so incredibly fiddly to try and figure out how exactly you do that. And the funding for that is not there. And the clarity that we keep coming back to in terms of policy is not there either. So I think the adoption bit isn't that people are unwilling, but there are the incentives. They're not even misaligned. They just don't exist yet. There is no real incentive other than feeling you're doing your bit. And so I think we need the sort of shift that needs to come between linking what Carney and the GFAN's announcements at COP said around, the huge pots of money that are there. Fine, demonstrate to me how that channels down to a homeowner in East Sussex, to a renter in a social housing property in West London, and to a renter in a PRS property in Bristol. Show me how each of those people can tap into that funding, either as an owner or as a renter, in order to get their property, and that they feel that they are partly accountable, because the challenge with residential energy use and emissions is that it's the individual, and we as a landlord shouldn't have control over all of that. We only have the common areas, but those are the kind of translations down to kind of granular scale that we need.
So Alex has mentioned funding, so it might be a good point at which to just talk a little bit about how the banks can influence this and change behavior, and obviously help with the cost. I mean, Guy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, probably more in relation to the commercial world than the private sector sort of house ownership. But I think Alex is right that we have to create incentives through sort of green financing. But the biggest needle mover is if banks stop lending on brown real estate. That is the biggest needle mover. Now, again, it's in the housing sector, that's going to impact probably the people hardest who can't afford it, but at the same time it will shift the system significantly, and that's what we need structural shifts. And in the commercial world, that will immediately play through to value, right? And I think that we haven't fully sort of underpinned the values with this sort of transitionary cost in residential or in commercial. So of course, people aren't justifying it because they can't see the added benefit. Whereas if everything was rebased on the basis that, you haven't got a resilient asset there, then it would be slightly different. So I think the banks have got an incredible role to play in terms of not just the funding from the capital side, but from the debt side. I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether they use that to make a real statement to the market in terms of drawing a line in the sand on what a brown asset is and what you can get debt on. Now that is a complete game changer all around the world. So watch this space.
So that could be incredibly difficult for the homeowner. If the lender decides that unless a certain amount of money is spent on retrofitting, then there won't be funding. So, Rob, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think we've already started to see this shift in social housing. So when we go out for a bond now, I mean, Clarion were kind of leaders in this space, not probably less than 2 years ago that we went for our first green bond, our first ESG bond, and got our sustainability accreditation alongside that. Now you have to be ESG. In order to raise money through the capital markets as a social housing landlord, you really have to be ESG. That's what the market is kind of demanding in terms of that. And I think it's that shift that we need to see in other financial markets where the people who are investing in those markets demand that the money is kind of put into organizations who are ESG, social impact organizations.
So we've touched on technology and R&D and what could be achieved. I mean, should the government be doing more to fund R&D. I mean, we know as a sector, real estate has not, been in the forefront of investment in R&D, but if ever there was a time, it is now. I mean, do we think the government could be doing more to support this? Guy, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think Rob's got his hand up, so I'm happy to follow. I've got a strong opinion on it, but I'm happy to follow Rob.
Rob, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, I'll probably just give the government some credit in this space in terms of what they are doing. Through Bays, there's a hell of a lot going on, and we're involved in the social housing decarbonation fund, and we've run the pilot, and we're bidding for wave one, and that is innovation. That is looking in terms of what retrofitting sort of you need on a house on particular different types of housing, particularly the ones that are the hardest to treat, I guess, in terms of that side of it, and then trying to stimulate the supply chains and the innovation around it by putting some money into that. And so that is innovation, and that what that will lead to is not just us finding the better solutions, but also to this price of the technology that's going into it starting to fall, which is what we need to see. The price of an air source heat pump today hopefully won't be the same price in 5 years' time once you've got that volume and you've got more players in the market. And at the same time, they are looking at things like hydrogen and other things. There is a lot of innovation, I think, coming through Bays, but there's probably more that needs to be done. I think it's an area where the government needs to seed the way, isn't it, in terms of bringing in investment and giving innovators and suppliers some certainty that they can play in this space and try and find some solutions, because we need a lot of different solutions for a lot of different problems. And I think that is the government's role, to seed those markets and try to get us along the way.
Alex, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's easy to kick government, isn't it? But there's a huge amount of innovation also, not just in Bays, in DEFRA. They're looking at things like biodiversity net gain, kind of peat bog, and kind of how we can regain all the amazing strength of kind of carbon deposits from that. There's a huge amount of work, obviously, around planning reform going on, and whatever your kind of personal views as to where that's going, the fact that it's at least being looked at a spatial level rather than just a kind of vote-winning level is really, really important. And I think one of the roles that I'm fortunate to have is I'm an independent commissioner for the Geospatial Commission, which is all about the use of location data, which we've all kind of interacted with in test and trace and things like that. But actually, it's super important to things like planning, red lines, valuation office, ordnance survey. All of these bodies have enormous amounts of data that's really, really useful, both to our sector, but to also creating innovation. And there are some phenomenal pilots that I'm learning about as a new commissioner going on. We're actually starting to pull together an expert group looking at land use data. And we've spent years on panels like this talking about the importance of data, gathering more data, understanding more data. The fact that government is actually corralling the huge amount of data that it has and trying to liaise with the industry experts. And I've got a fantastic expert commission that we've pulled together, and we're starting next year to really look at that. I'm super excited about, because I think that could unlock those kind of known knowns, unknown knowns that we all have. We know it's there somewhere, but we don't quite know who has it. So I think that could be really exciting. One specific example that already exists in Scotland, so Location Data Scotland is the kind of umbrella group of all the bodies, and it includes sort of academics and others. But there's been an academic project called Dynamic Coast, and you can look at their website, dynamiccoast.com. And it's fantastic. It basically does flood mapping. And it's just around kind of Scotland, and obviously lots of golf courses who are quite concerned, but equally lots of other kind of coastal cities. The bit that I think is really phenomenal, that I'm fascinated by, that they've mapped, is coastal erosion and social disadvantage mapping together. And on this island that we have, that's something that nobody, I don't think, has ever really looked at in that spatial way. And that's a phenomenal use of government data, and then understanding things. It might surface issues that people sort of intuitively were aware of, but didn't have anything to hang policy on. So I think we are starting to see these tools being used, but it's about continually having those conversations, as you're always talking about collaboration, Susan, but it's an ongoing process. So the risk, I think, sometimes has been with government that they say, we've consulted, so that's it, it's done now. And actually they don't realise that you need to maintain those conversations onwards.
Yes, and you talk about starting these things and just knowing, how quickly things are happening on climate change. It's a little bit alarming to be talking about starting things, but
Well, there's
hopefully
specific pilots, so that's allowed. It's not like we're trying to do policy, but yeah, we're starting a pilot program.
So Guy, what do you think we're doing enough on our R&D, or could the government be doing more?
Oh no, we can't rely on the government for R&D. I think what Rob said is very good. We should actually credit them for seeding certain aspects. But let's look at where massive innovation's taken place in other industries. It's happened through the private sector. It's happened through multiple investment channels, VC, stuff like this. There's loads of capital out there investing in innovation. And if you look at the motor industry, of course, there's regulation coming in now about electric cars, but that's not what started it, is it? I mean, it was innovation from Tesla which started it. It changed the whole industry. And what I noticed from being at COP for a few weeks is those industries that are under more threat are the ones that are innovating most. The problem with real estate is it doesn't feel it's under threat because the model's been working and it's kind of continuing to work. So the least threat you feel, the least innovation you do. I mean, I tend to ask most businesses, how much of your total investment is going into R&D? Not a lot is the answer. There's lots of partnerships going on, lots of pilots going on, but it's very, very marginal in terms of impacting short-term returns. To truly innovate, you've got to really massively double down and invest in it. And I think that this is where the real estate investment model struggles, quite frankly, because it hasn't taken into account the innovation required, and it's not necessarily under a lot of threat. So once you get into the mindset of existential threat, and whether it's climate or other things that are driving that, you become much more innovative as a business. And I think that if we can get into that mindset, then we'll try new things a lot more. There's a big fear of failure out there. And of course, trying a new thing means that you have to fail at it first, probably, before you learn how to do it well. And perhaps we could all do with the odd failure, a few more failures to open source it. I mean, of course, the big words out of COP26 were radical collaboration. We don't open source enough in this industry. Failures and successes, make it available to all. That is a great way for this industry to progress. And so I just greatly encourage all businesses out there to do that and show that it is possible to transition assets, even if you sometimes fail, or you sometimes, the first time you do it, it might not make much money. The second time makes a bit more. The third time it makes even more. And before you know it, you've got a successful model. So let's share and open source these examples a bit more.
It's interesting you say that the real estate industry doesn't feel under threat, because what we've been discussing about funding and the way funders are looking at this, I would have thought spelt out threat. But also, just picking up on the collaboration point, are real estate companies coming together enough to collaborate on this? Because actually coming together and sharing R&D, sharing knowledge would seem to be the way forward, rather than companies actually doing it individually. So Alex, I mean, in the housing world, I mean, are the housing associations coming together to pool their resources?
I would say exactly as Rob said. I think social housing has actually led on this. So the social housing sustainability reporting standard was established and very genuinely delivered through collaboration. And I think the people who led on that, sort of like Catherine Rainsford, have done an amazing job to kind of pull something really coherent and robust together, and pulling in people like me who's not specifically involved day to day with social housing, but kind of working on it from a different angle, which meant that when we started the BPF working group on institutional kind of PRS, we were able to kind of pull in people the other way and do that. So I think that there's a huge amount of collaboration going on. I think the challenge that Guy alluded to in terms of the kind of tiering of the sector, so the bigger players, the institutions who can afford to do the analysis, to divest from the assets that aren't performing and get rid of them, and they'll still be in the housing market somewhere because somebody will take them and rent them, and whether they you know, given that there are landlords who are happy to break every existing bit of regulation around safety and well-being, I'm not sure that they'll be bothered about carbon either. So, you know, there's a real risk in that sense. The bit that frustrates me really is to parallel it with the adoption of MMC. So, you know, we know there is a huge amount of work and innovation going on. Mark Farmer has pioneered, you know, some really pushed the sector to try and get them to collaborate, and pointed out that the UK is pretty much the only developed economy that hasn't got a combined kind of shared pool of R&D resource for MMC. But despite that, the major frustration is until there's standardization of components, there's some kind of baseline agreement, as opposed to just this private, I'm going to hang on to the IP of my system, you will not get the mass adoption that you need to make it a really scalable, usable tool in the UK. Fundamentally, if I have to go to an investment committee and say, let's use system A, but by the way, if they go bust, we have any problems, you have to demolish the whole thing and use system B because there's no standardized components. Like, that's bonkers. That's a barrier to adoption. And so I think even with all the effort and the collaboration that has gone into MMC, it is falling at that hurdle, because I think the industry is going back to what British real estate has tended to do, which is, you know, picking competition on a plane that is very much about IP and what we know. If you look at other markets, it's interesting to see how competition is absolutely there, but perhaps in different areas. And so maybe in the US kind of multifamily market, you compete on quality of service, not on pricing. So if this pricing is much more transparent, because everybody kind of knows that that's just what it is, and it's about they're playing as an industry. I think our sector has a lot to learn from that kind of approach.
Okay. And Guy, do you think there could be more collaboration on the you know, on the commercial side, or are companies collaborating to look at you know, innovation, R&D?
There could be a lot more collaboration. I think Alex makes a really good point there on modern methods of construction, even standardizing audits, the way we measure carbon in buildings, all these sort of things. There is, if I hear another client say, yeah, I want to use this climate story as a first mover advantage, I'm like, really? I roll my eyes the whole time. Really? Is that what this is about? I'm not sure that is what this is about. Because if we collaborate, we're definitely going to create much more impact, even on data and such like. But I think having industry standards is really important. I don't mean health and safety. Well, actually, we've probably done it on health and safety. I think construction industry did collaborate on health and safety far better than they have done on embodied carbon, on modern methods of construction and such like. And Alex is right to point to other countries. You know, not only in the US do they collaborate more as an industry, but the data's far better in the US. So we can actually, you know, the Brits can actually be part of the problem in that the way we do things is a little bit siloed. Oh, my business has got the IP. Well, on certain things here, we may be able to share data, share measurement standards. This is a complex subject, and we have to try and, as an industry, simplify it. And honestly, that will enhance our industry reputationally. You know, I'm taking on the presidency of the BPF, and we're still challenged around that in terms of how we represent ourselves to the public, to other stakeholders, lenders, government, public authorities. And if we collaborate more, then that will enhance our reputation as well in terms of trying to solve some of these big problems together.
No, it would be good if we could, because as we discussed quite a lot, the image of the real estate sector is not great. And when you know, you couple that with the fact that we are responsible for a large percentage of carbon emissions, we really, I think, do need to be seen to be coming together with you know, coming up with some solutions. And we've talked quite a lot about, you know, the government, what the government has been doing, but what about looking at a more sort of regional and local level? Because it seems to me that local authorities could have more of a role in bringing some of this together, in educating the public in terms of what, you know, what everybody could be doing to reduce carbon emissions. And Rob, do you have any thoughts on what the local authority, or how the local authorities come into the picture?
Well, yeah, absolutely. They need to adapt and have their own sustainability strategies. And local authorities offer many different services, so they have to look at each of those services and what those mean in terms of 2050. But it's not just about the E of ESG with local authorities. It's very much about the S as well. A lot of their services are around what is good for society and what is good for community. So they have to build a lot of that into it as well in terms of planning forward. I mean, some of the big changes are going to be things like electric charging points, and how local authorities start to fund and roll out electric charging points, and actually that they probably become separate businesses within the local authorities as they become quite major landlords of things like electric charging points. But there's an education piece that goes alongside that needs to happen. And it's the same, if you look at waste management, another one, the role of waste management in terms of sustainability, and how governments and local authorities collect all of our waste. Well, they're already recycling strategies, but they are going to have to evolve and change to a place where you're educating households around zero waste, effectively, if we want to get to, and how do we get to that point in the future. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done at that local level around a variety of services, but at the same time, they need to still be able to provide, the social services and the other aspects to make sure that we are being, holistically sustainable, not just for concentrating on the environment side.
And Alex?
Yeah, I think Rob's right to point that there's a huge amount of work already happening. And also, just let's be realistic, that local authorities are incredibly, cash strapped and have had to deal with rounds of cuts for years and years now. So asking them to do new things, actually what I think a lot of the really proactive authorities have done is seen climate change as a way to actually drive better efficiency. So in things like their waste collection, and things like, in Bristol where I live, they've adopted a kind of a kind of carbon strategy in the city centre, which is incredibly badly polluted, and basically used COVID as a reason to pilot a kind of a city centre pedestrian only area that's been really successful. And there are some challenges, but they're pushing the envelope a lot more. I think the important thing to recognise with local authorities is that when there is innovation, they are not allowed to fail. And so the really key point that Guy made earlier about, whole thing of innovation and how you learn is making mistakes, getting over it and picking up. When that happens with public money, it's a scandal, it's a crisis, and it's a problem. And so the obvious example is Robin Hood Energy in Nottingham, which was a really innovative and I think great idea as a concept of a scheme of a local authority setting up as an energy company, being able to mandate, and for whatever reason that failed, it failed spectacularly and is now called a scandal. That disincentivizes enormously other local authorities from trying to do those innovative things, because the risk is high, because innovation is risky. And so I think we are putting a huge amount of expectation on poorly resourced and underfunded bodies to try and come up with innovation in an environment where they've got even less flex to fail than a private sector entity with shareholders. But having said that, there's lots of really good innovation happening. So I worry that sometimes trying to reinvent the wheel and just start with a blank sheet, we're not very good at looking at what's already happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've got the cash-strapped local authorities. We've got private sector that does have money. How can the public and private sector best work together to help drive this forward? Guy?
Well, I think particularly in relation to the social element, there are companies out there that are looking to drive social impact as a spearhead of their ESG strategy, not just the E part. And I think there is real opportunity to collaborate with local authorities on that. But honestly, it takes leadership. It takes leadership on both sides. And identifying the local authorities that have that leadership is really important for private enterprise, and not all of them do. And I actually met up with Marvin, the mayor of Bristol, at COP, and he does have real leadership on climate. And I said to him, what is it that you need to go quicker? And he just said money. I've got no money. I've got so he, that's a leader who will work with private enterprise to make things happen, and I think they do exist. And it's about marrying up those leaders from the private companies with the public authorities and local authorities to make things happen. And there is a lot of repurposing of town centres that needs to go on, whether it's in relation to housing, whether it's in relation to buildings that just are not need to be used for something different. There's a lot of surplus retail, the car parking in city centres. All of that needs to be rethought, and find the visionary leaders of local authorities. They are out there, and they're very inspirational people that can work with private enterprise, but they won't be everywhere. So I think that's the best thing to do, is create partnerships through trust, through personal relationships, and through putting sort of equity sharing in place, true equity sharing, so that risk is managed on both sides of the equation.
So is there anything more that could be done to, I suppose it's like sort of bringing these people together, or is it just a question of randomly meeting somebody?
It'll be interesting in 10, 20 years time whether cities and local authorities do have more devolved powers. In some countries where they do, you see a lot more, I suppose, interaction taking place. Actually, New York at the moment has got the most aggressive tax on buildings that have high carbon emissions coming in 2024. They've actually put $268 a ton on that tax, which is a pretty high figure to try and get things done. There are other cities in the US like Denver who are issuing green bonds to raise money, right, and invest in. So there's some quite proactive things being done in US cities where they do have a lot of devolved power. Same in Germany, where they've got a lot of devolved power. And I think there are lessons to be learned. We could copy and paste some of those things from other countries, but there's only so much power that either these mayors or local authorities might have, and it's usually around planning. So we've just got to work with what we've got. But I would say that there is, let's invest some time in that, because that is going to be a really, really important part of reinvigorating communities, of dealing with the climate challenges out there. And it's got to be an aim to have more of those public and private partnerships going on.
Yes, I think that must be important, and obviously there's nothing like a carbon tax to concentrate people's minds. And Rob, do you have any other thoughts on how we can bring public and private sector together to actually achieve positive change?
Yeah, we have to do this all the time. I think in housing, we work alongside our local authority partners up and down the country. We are often, we are, the homes that we own used to be local authority homes. They've been transferred to us, and we have, nominations agreements up and down the country for the social housing waiting lists up and down the country, working closely with local authorities. So in terms of, the homes that we have to try and make to zero carbon by 2050, it's also the community aspects and all the services that go in to support them and make them sustainable communities. So we have to have deep links with local authority in order to achieve what we need to achieve. They are true partners up and down the country for us.
Well, that's good. I think we are nearly out of time, so I know we could go on for longer, and there's clearly a lot to be done, and I mean this collaboration point I think is going to be fairly key going forward. So thank you all, and I'm going to hand back to Lee.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, and thank you, Susan, for chairing. That was a great discussion, and clearly it's a very complicated situation, and there is no one size fit all, as everybody said, and it's different for the different areas of real estate. And clearly, housing is a big problem, and as you said, retail, and it's slightly easier, I guess, in the commercial space. But it's good that there was certainly more of a presence, I think, at COP in terms of the real estate industry and the UK. I think that's positive. I think that really is. And I think the fact that there is nowhere to hide for business and government in the next year or two, I think, needs accountability, obviously, to move things forward. And as we said, sort of the innovation. And obviously talking about things like EPCs, there needs to be new ways of kind of measuring. We need to have better data. And lots of collaboration that came up a number of times. I think the private and public sector collaboration. Clearly, governments, can only do so much, and we have to just be realistic about what to expect from them, as kind of everybody said in the discussion today. But maybe there's more to be done by banks in terms of kind of green lending, and what their criteria are for